So we finished section 1, and the discussion topic was about whether it's reasonable or appropriate that the set of 8 pairs of mental states used in the context of reading other people's minds for more than 90% of the time in the suttas is imported and inserted into DN 22 and MN 10. One line of reasoning is that it's okay, it's appropriate and reasonable, because in order for one to be able to read other people's minds using these 8 pairs of mental states, one has to firstly understand or experience these mental states within oneself. But I also pointed out that when you want to talk about generality, even the first 3 pairs of greed, hatred and delusion will be sufficient to wash the mind in order to become an arahant, even without recourse to any of the 5 grounds of acceptance. It may not necessarily have all those 8 pairs that were most of the time used in the context of reading other people's minds. But then, even these 8 pairs are not comprehensive enough to show us the scope of Cittānupassanā, the scope of the mental states that we can observe within ourselves. In this section, we are going to explore excerpts from other suttas in which the Buddha or his disciples gave specific instructions to the monks to observe certain mental states within themselves. These were all used in the context of, one, for personal development, whether it's on the interpersonal or communal interaction point of view, or even from the meditative point of view. We shall now go through a brief summary of the excerpts that I have compiled in the booklet. So let's start off with Ānāpānassati Sutta, the first excerpt, MN 118. As I said earlier, except for DN 22 and MN 10, nowhere else in the suttas did the Buddha give any details of how to practice each of the 4 Satipaṭṭhānas. But then Ānāpānassati Sutta is another exception. In Ānāpānassati Sutta, we have Cittānupassanā specifically mentioned by the Buddha and elaborated in terms of 4 modes. The first one is experiencing the mind. The second is gladdening the mind. The third is concentrating or composing the mind. And the last one is liberating the mind. We can see that there are some overlaps in terms of mental states, especially the last 2. In the N22 and MN10, we have whether the mind is concentrated or not, composed or not, and whether or not the mind is liberated. But whereas in DN22 and MN10, there is just mere observation and acknowledgement of the mental state, something passive. Here is more active, is training the mind. I should breathe in, experiencing mind. I train himself by breathing in, experiencing the mind, breathing out, experiencing the mind, and so forth. So it is more active in a sense. And experiencing the mind is so general that it encompasses everything that's in the mind. And then the next one is gladdening the mind, which is making the mind happy. These are about the only details of Cittānupassanā that can be found in the suttas, apart from DN 22 and MN 10, which I suspect to be a later compilation, not authentic suttas, discoursed by the Buddha himself. Now, I want to point out here that liberating the mind here means liberating the mind from successive levels of obstacles to attain Samādhi and insight. Some of you may not be familiar with the 4 Tetrads of Ānāpānassati that are mentioned in this sutta. The reason why the Buddha included these 4 modes of Cittānupassanā in Ānāpānassati Sutta is rather puzzling. Because what does it say? The Buddha says the reason why these 4 modes is included as Cittānupassanā in this third Tetrad is because there is sati and sampajanya. There is mindfulness and clear comprehension or clear awareness. This seems to be rather strange, isn't it? Because why must this be a qualification for these 4 modes to be inserted in the third mode of Ānāpānassati Sutta? Isn't mindfulness and clear awareness the first general principle that I talked about earlier on, that is universally applicable to each of the 4 Satipaṭṭhānas, not only to Cittānupassanā? This is something which has puzzled modern scholars, and the commentaries say nothing about this, really, not much about it. But if you know Chinese, you can check what the Chinese Āgama has to say, the parallel of this Ānāpānassati Sutta. And it seems that the rationale given there is more reasonable and not so puzzling. So if you want to find out, you can go to Sutta Central online and you key in MN118 without a space between MN and 118. And then it will bring you to Ānāpānassati Sutta of a Pali tradition plus the parallel in the Chinese Āgama. And then you can look at the translation of this part where the Buddha gave the rationale behind including Cittānupassanā in Ānāpānassati. Now, not only is Cittānupassanā included in Ānāpānassati in the sutta, but all the other Satipaṭṭhānas are also included. So, if you look at the 4 Tetrads of Ānāpānassati Sutta, they are actually arranged according to the 4 Satipaṭṭhānas. They are not arranged according to the sequence of practice. It's not that you do the first Tetrad first, and then you go on to the second, and you go on to the third, and you go on to the fourth. What are the 4 Tetrads? The first Tetrad is about being aware of a long breath or a short breath, experiencing the whole body, tranquilizing Kaya Sankhara. Kaya Sankhara here is explained by the Buddha as the breath itself, tranquilizing the breath. And then the second Tetrad is classified as Vedananupassana. And this one is as you breathe in and you breathe out, you train yourself to experience rapture, to experience happiness, to experience Citta Sankhara, and to tranquilize Citta Sankhara. You see, in the first Tetrad, it's obvious why it is called Kayanupassana, or contemplation of the body, or repeated observation of the body, because long breath, short breath, experiencing the whole body. Body here could be defined as whatever can be felt through the body as well as the breath itself, because the breath is also a body. And then tranquilizing the breath body, the breath itself. So these are all connected with the physical aspect. Therefore, it's classified as Kayanupassana. Here, because rapture itself is not Vedana, but rapture is accompanied by pleasant feeling, so is happiness. And Citta Sankhara here is defined as Sanya and Vedana, perception and feeling. So there's also feeling inside here. You're experiencing the Sanya and the feeling. Because feeling is there, it is included under Vedananupassana. And then in Cittānupassana, you can see very clearly that everything here is about the Citta. Experiencing the Citta as a whole, gladdening the Citta, composing the Citta, liberating the Citta, and therefore is placed under Cittānupassana. Finally, we have Dhammanupassana, which is repeatedly observing impermanence, or observing fading away, observing cessation, observing relinquishment. Now, what is interesting about this is that for each of the first three Satipaṭṭhānas, their objects are confined to their particular sphere. Kaya-Anupassana is just about physicality, about the body. Vedana-Anupassana is just about feelings. And Citta-Anupassana is just about the mind. And therefore you have in the stock phrase, he dwells repeatedly observing the body in the body. He dwells repeatedly observing feelings in feelings, the mind in the mind, Dhamma in Dhamma. You do Kaya-Anupassana only in relation to the body. You don't do Kaya-Anupassana in relation to feelings. You don't do Kaya-Anupassana in relation to Citta, to the mind. Each of these three have their specific respective objects confined to their own spheres. But it is different with Dhamma-Anupassana. While you are practicing the first Tetrad, you are aware of the long breath and the short breath, you are experiencing the whole body, you are trying to tranquilize the breath. While you are doing that, you can also practice Dhamma-Anupassana because you can observe the impermanent nature of your breath. You can observe the impermanent nature of things that are happening to your body. It's the same with Vedana-Anupassana. While you are doing Vedana-Anupassana, you are experiencing rapture, happiness, and perceptions and feelings. You can also see their impermanence. And of course, Citta-Anupassana, you can see the impermanence of the mind as you try to experience it, gladden it, compose it, liberating it. I will give you a very good example. This is when you're watching pain. When you're watching pain, if you're looking at the elements, you're looking at pain in terms of hardness or softness, it's a piercing pain, it's a poking pain, it's a very fiery pain. That is watching the elements, that is Kaya-Anupassana. But on the other hand, if you're looking at feelings, the discomfort in the body, or the unpleasant feeling in the mind, that is Vedana-Anupassana. Or if you're watching how the mind is reacting with aversion, trying to push it away, or the mind is able to step back and look at it very objectively without being affected by it, that is Citta-Anupassana. If you are looking at the arising and passing away of the elements, that's Dhamma-Anupassana. If you are looking at the arising and passing away of feelings, sometimes it's comfortable, sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's pleasant, sometimes it's unpleasant in the mind, sometimes it's just indifference, that is neutral. That is Vedana-Anupassana. But if you see how these feelings change, it is Dhamma-Anupassana, repeatedly observing impermanence in respect of feelings. Or you can also repeatedly observe impermanence in respect of the mind, because the reaction to the pain changes. And then the mind is sometimes glad, sometimes it's not glad, sometimes it's composed, sometimes it's not composed. So you are watching impermanence of the mind. This Dhamma-Anupassana actually can be applied to any of the three objects for the respective Satipaṭṭhānas. You can also observe Dhamma-Anupassana within itself to see that this idea of impermanence that you can see is not always there. Sometimes you look at the pain and you observe that it is impermanent, it is changing. But if your Samadhi is not good enough, you look at it and you think that it lasts for so long, for the whole sitting of half an hour or 15 minutes. But if you have got good Samadhi, you look at it, you can see that it's arising and passing away from moment to moment. Okay? And then you can see also how this Dhamma-Anupassana, that this ability to observe impermanence also changes. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there, depending on your level of composure and depending on your level of insight. Okay, so what is interesting is that in DN22 and MN10, you all know that the first tetrad of Ānāpānassati is included in Kaya-Anupassana. That is the first exercise. But then strangely, why are the other tetrads not included in the respective Satipaṭṭhānas? These were specifically mentioned by the Buddha in MN 118, and yet they were not included in DN 22 and MN 10. So this is another discrepancy that begs the question, that gives me the suspicion that DN 22 and MN 10 are not the authentic teachings of the Buddha, but were compiled by later elders out of good intention to help meditators start somewhere, because the instructions given by the Buddha were so vague. The instruction was just, you should dwell repeatedly observing the body in the body, ardent, fully aware, and mindful, having put away longing and dejection in regard to the world. It's so general that you don't know where to start. Perhaps those compilers, actually out of compassion for beginners, they started to put in details so they can start somewhere. But these are not consistent, and these may not actually be appropriate. And now we go on to the next sutta, Sacitta Sutta. This is a very interesting sutta, because in this sutta it says that if you are not skilled in the ways of others' minds, then you should try to be skilled in the ways of your own mind. What does this mean? Which means is that if you want to watch your own mind first, before you watch other people's minds, you don't start off by watching these 8 pairs that are mentioned in DN 22 and MN 10. You start off by looking at these 10 pairs that are mentioned in these suttas. And these 10 pairs are more comprehensive in nature, because they cover your daily life as well as meditation. The first 5 pairs or 6 pairs or 7 pairs, 8 pairs, they are really more applicable to daily life. And maybe the last 2 pairs about whether you are lazy or whether you are concentrated or composed, that is applicable for both daily and meditative situations. And of course, the first 5 pairs are actually another way of classifying the 5 hindrances, which you will also meet with in the beginning stages of your meditation practice. Samatha Sutta here has a different list. Again, it says that if you are not skilled in the ways of others' minds, you should be skilled in the ways of your own mind, first by looking at whether you've got Samatha and Vipassanā. But here I want to point out one thing. In this sutta, in this second point, it says that if you don't have Samatha, but you have Vipassanā, then you should base yourself on Vipassanā to develop Samatha. Which means to say that the Buddha explicitly stated that one can actually practice Vipassanā first and then develop Samatha later, which is not our common understanding. Our popular understanding is that you must have some degree of composure first, or some degree of Samatha first, before you can start to practice Vipassanā. Correct. But how is this possible? I often say that in the practice of open mindfulness, you can attain 3 levels of Samadhi. These do not necessarily tally with the 4 jhanas. The first level of Samadhi is when the mind is still restless, but because you apply Ara anchor, you are able to just step back and observe the restless mind coming and going without trying to push them away, without getting dragged into this restlessness. You are just able to step back and observe them come and go, without resistance, without being dragged by them. This is a form of composure. This is where you can actually see the 3 characteristics. Things are changing all the time. It's suffering. You don't want it, but it's still there. And there's no one in control. These things keep on happening because of causes and conditions. If you're able to persist in that objective observation of what's happening, without trying to force the mind to be composed, it will naturally become quieter and quieter. There will be gaps in between the thinking, and these gaps will become longer and longer. And so that's when you get to the second stage of Samadhi, and that's where there are gaps in between thoughts. And when there are gaps in between thoughts, then you can see causes and conditions why certain thoughts arise and pass away. Finally, you go on to the third level of composure which is thought-free. No more thoughts at all. There's just the mindfulness of what's happening at the senses without any thoughts about the past, the future, or even about the present. Okay, so the first stage of composure is not stillness of the mind. The mind is not still, but it's composed. It's able to step back and watch all these things happening without reaction. Based on this, because you can see the three characteristics to some degree, then this gives you a sort of composure of samadhi that is wisdom-based. You're able to accept things. It becomes so obvious that things are coming and going of their own accord. There's nothing you can do to stop them except by just stepping back and watching and allow them to go off on their own when the causes and conditions are there. So based on this, then you can develop samatha. And that's when you go on to the second level and the third level. And the third level is almost like the second jhana. If there is rapture and happiness also, then it will be the second jhana. If there's no rapture and happiness, but just thought-free, then it's not the second jhana, it's a pre-jhanic samadhi state. Okay, so this is very obvious in this sutta. There's also another sutta that's called the Tatiya Samadhi Sutta, which talks about this, where the Buddha also said that it is possible to gain Vipassanā first before you go on to develop samatha. Parihāna Sutta is almost similar to the first one, Sacitta Sutta. I think the first 7 pairs are similar. It's just the last 3 pairs are a bit different. This presents even a more comprehensive mental states, and most of them are used for meditation. In the 8th quality, we have internal joy of the Dhamma. What does this mean? This means internal joy pertaining to the Dhamma, either by listening to the Dhamma, reciting it, intellectually understanding it, or by experiencing the truth of it. When you do any of these things, joy could arise in you that is related to the Dhamma. So this is the internal joy of the Dhamma. Anumāna Sutta, the background behind this is this. Some of you may know that we monks, when we have successfully completed the Vassa, the 3 months rainy season retreat, then every monk is supposed to make an open invitation to the Sangha. To paraphrase the invitation, it goes something like this. Bhante, I invite the Sangha to criticize me out of compassion if they have seen, heard, or suspected of any misdeed that I've done. If I see this, then I will amend myself, or will make amends for myself, or will correct myself. This is according to Vinaya rules and regulation. Every monk has to make that open invitation to the Sangha at the end of the Vassa, if they have completed the Vassa successfully. However, in reality, I think the vast majority of monks don't really mean what they say. This is only a mere formality, because it requires a high degree of spiritual maturity to be able to accept criticism without being defensive. When I was still in SBS, we tried to do that because we just had a very small community, a handful of monks. And sometimes there were quarrels among monks, accusing one another of certain misdeeds. It's not an easy task. So anyway, this is the background of the story. In this sutta, Āyasmā Moggallana addressed the monks. And he said that even though you have made this open invitation to the Sangha, but if you have all these negative qualities, nobody is going to say anything to you. And you will notice that in these negative qualities that were listed out by Āyasmā Moggallana, there are about 7 of them that pertain to anger. Yeah, reactions that stem from anger. So you can see that it's not just being aware of, being mindful of whether the mind is with hate or without hate. It is also the various manifestations of this in so many ways in your mental state, in the way you react to others. This one is more of introspection of behavioral mental states that are related to interpersonal and communal interaction. Of course, you need to watch your mind to be able to control yourself, right? And finally, we have Upakkilesa Sutta, MN 128. This one is more related to subtle mental states in the course of meditation. And the background story is that Āyasmā Anuruddha, who was later to become the foremost disciple of the Buddha in the practice of the divine eye. He was the one most skilled in the usage of the divine eye. But in this particular case, there was just the beginning of his practice. And he had encountered some problems while he was trying to develop the skill, and the Buddha came to his aid by sharing with him the Buddha's own personal experience when he was trying to develop the divine eye. Right? So these are all about very subtle mental states that are encountered in the process of meditation when one is trying to develop the psychic power, how to identify them and to abandon them in order to make progress in the meditation. All right? So these are the mental states that are mentioned in this section. What we see is that most of the introspections in this section are accompanied by right effort. You identify them first, and then after that you try to abandon them. The simile given is like someone whose hair is on fire, or whose head is on fire, and you will try to douse it as quickly as possible. So that is the urgency. Of course, this is applicable to full-time meditators, and you have to use your discretion to modify them to your behavior in daily life, because you are lay people and you still have a lot of worldly obligations to fulfill. You are not free from the influence by sensual pleasures. But you see, here is all about right effort. Whereas in Cittānupassanā, as we see in DN 22 and MN 10, there's just mere acknowledgement. You just recognize the mental states and you just acknowledge them, and there's nothing mentioned about trying to abandon them. But here, there's accompanied by right effort. Okay, so this is what all these excerpts are all about. Let's look at the discussion topic, and I hope that you do understand what it really means before you share your findings later on. This list already shows us that the scope of Cittānupassanā is so wide compared to the impression we get when we look at DN 22 and MN 10. So now you have another option. Besides those 8 that were listed in DN 22 and MN 10, could there be something more appropriate or reasonable that can be used to replace that list in DN 22 and MN 10? Something that could be more comprehensive in nature to show the nature and scope of Cittānupassanā.